Welcome to Government Contracting Weekly, sponsored by AOC Key Solutions Incorporated. Government Contracting Weekly is the only television program devoted exclusively to the competitive and dynamic world of government contracting. A world where coming in second place is not an option, but where principle-centered winning is the only approach.
Good morning and welcome back to Government Contracting Weekly. This morning we're addressing the really important issue of sequestration. The potential of sequestration, but the reality of budget cuts. So let's get right to it. Welcome back to our segment where we interview one of the experts in our region, and we're delighted this morning to have with us Jim Dinegar from the Board of Trade.
Good morning, Hillary.
Thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Just recently you had this event on sequestration, and I must say that while most of the associations in this region and many organizations are going to be addressing this, you were one of the first out of the gate. Kudos on that, and why? What does it mean to our region and your members in particular, Jim?
Well, the Greater Washington Board of Trade really does pride itself on providing good guidance early enough that people can get their hands around the critical issues facing business in Greater Washington. And this is one of the biggest, most critical issues we've seen in a long time. Unfortunately, a lot of people haven't been paying enough attention. They think that this is like a government shutdown. Gee, they'll figure it out at the last minute. But we are very pessimistic that they'll figure this out in time.
Yeah, because people have said that there's a 50% chance of this going through, which is high, 100% chance of budget cuts anyway.
Well, they need to figure out how they're going to balance the budget, how they're going to reduce the deficit, but just doing this across the board is so sloppy, and yet we need to all respond to it because currently it's the law of the land. The closer we get to January 2nd, the more realistic it is that this is going to take hold.
And it's having a reverberation throughout the entire region, so your members across the board are going to be affected.
Well, during the conference, it was very clear that this is not just for government contractors. This has to do with retail establishments, housing, you name it. It's far-reaching effects on the Greater Washington region, certainly more than other regions around the country.
Yes, and actually speaking of that, your speakers covered different aspects of the industry in this region, and maybe we could just take a look now at the first speaker was Dr. Hillen. He was the president and CEO of Sotera. Maybe we just take a look at that clip and have our audience see some of your program.
Yes.
So let's not fool ourselves. The sequestration cuts are rationalized by only one basis, affordability. And I think we should look at that. Affordability is important. You know, even though this is the first function of the federal government, national defense, and it's also a function that only the federal government can do, unlike many other goods and services the federal government provides, it can't be supplemented by state or local or private efforts. National defense, the government's got a monopoly on it. But even so, it's always got to be affordable. But the problem with the sequestration cuts on national security taken in the name of affordability is that the cuts will severely degrade our military capabilities. That argument's been made by others, including Bob Gates and Mike Mullen. I was just watching them on C-SPAN talking about that, the former Secretary of Defense and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. So I won't elaborate that, but severely degrade military capability. My problem is they won't make a difference budgetarily in the budget. And I'll take you through the math. In the period between 2012 and 2013, in which the Budget Control Act cuts defense spending by $55 billion, mandatory entitlement spending and interest on the debt will rise almost $75 billion. So in year one of sequestration, our defense savings are erased by the commensurate increase in other spending in just under 9 months. In year two, mandatory entitlements and interest on the debt, by the way, I'm assuming a historically low, 1 to 1.5% interest rate, those mandatory spending rises $154 billion. So the defense savings are overcome in just over 4 months. The next year, 3 months. As you can imagine, this gets worse. So in the very short term, let alone the medium and the long, we get precious little budget balancing and certainly almost no long-term federal debt benefit from the sequestration cuts on DOD. DOD is only 20% of the federal budget now, half of what it was 25 years ago, and going down fast as a percentage. So if we're hoping to balance either the annual federal budget deficit or especially the national debt on the back of the Department of Defense, it's just going to be too hard. The math just doesn't work. It's different math than those great guns versus butter debates we used to have, during the Reagan buildup in the mid-1980s. But in the meantime, we get real decline in military capabilities, aggravated, as was pointed out on the first panel, by the fact that the personnel accounts, which are the majority of spending in the Department of Defense, are off limits. So all these cuts will come to operations and maintenance, procurement, research, development, and all that. If we've learned anything from history, A peace dividend almost never provides an enduring peace, but it always delivers on preparedness. Peace dividends have a 100% track record in delivering on preparedness, and every American peace dividend in the past 100 years has been followed by a moment or a period of strategic unpreparedness that has unnecessarily cost American lives. So I think you can see that some people have said that the Pentagon's a little bit hysterical about that. Well, when you're playing for pretty high stakes and the gravity of your responsibilities is weighed in the way it is at the Pentagon, I don't think it's hysteric at all. It's just, it's not hysteria, it's history.
Jim, Dr. Hillen is talking about the cuts are going to be inevitable. We all know they're going to be inevitable, whether it's the sequestration going through on January 2nd and when it happens. At some juncture, it's still happening. It's an era of austerity. However, we all know it's more volatile than ever in the Middle East. It's a terrible time. He had his opinions on that, the volatility, and you know about this region. Tell us about what's happening in this region, what everybody must do, because you're big about preparedness.
Well, Dr. Hillen had some very strong views on the sequestration cuts, and really the across-the-board nature of this is what's bothering people so much, that it's not strategic, it's not well thought out, and then what's really maddening for the businesses in this region is that there's been very little guidance provided by the federal government. So it's every person for themselves at this point. The Board of Trade really did try to put together good guidance with some experts. Dr. Hillen was at the top of that list.
Yes.
He's front line as it relates to a government contractor. He's certainly high up within the Professional Services Council as their chair-elect. And so when he speaks, people listen. We were pleased to have him on the program.
Right, and actually he mentioned, like I think it was later, we're going to look at Deborah Nixon, the fact that businesses forecast. Government isn't thinking about that. Everybody has to plan for this and they're just not. So I think that you gave a lot of tips about the actual planning. What else do you think that Dr. Hillen said that was talking about preparation?
Well, I think that he moved past, as people really do need to move past, the fact that this may happen, it may not happen. I think he's a realist, and I certainly am, and we believe it will happen, and therefore people need to prepare now. And this is not just a couple of dollars here and there. These are massive adjustments to the overall budget, and this is going to be felt in the greater Washington region. Whether that leaves us less prepared as a country is something that the experts like Dr. Hillen feel very strongly about, and he's got some expertise.
Yes, and somebody I think quoted, I think it was Panetta, when they said about what this is going to do to the Defense Department.
Oh, there are big concerns, and it's, I'll remind people quickly that this is not just defense spending. This is defense on the half of the $1.2 trillion in cuts and non-defense spending, which is virtually every other type of program out there, most of those agencies resident in the greater Washington region.
That's right. And when you talk about what they should do to prepare, actually Peter Knickerbocker, he was there from Bank of America, I think he's a senior vice president, and he talked about what government contractors should do in preparing by meeting with their bankers, preparing their bankers, showing them what they're doing. Perhaps we'll look at one of those clips as well.
It was a big important step that people can't forget. They do need to sit down with their bankers. Their bankers want to understand what their contingency plans are, what their cash flow analysis is, how they're going to get through if it's a 15, 20% cut, how they're going to be dealing with this. And they're also very good advisors, so it's not an adversarial relationship. I think that Peter did a very good job.
He talked about teaming actually with your bank, I believe.
That's right.
Yes. So let's have a look at that clip if we may.
Okay.
Yes.
What I took away from many of the prior panelists was, and the best way to put it is, you know, having been in the financial services industry through 2008, was the inherent unintended consequences that could in fact arise through the implementation of sequestration. It's inherently challenging and difficult to navigate as a member of the business community. And you just don't know what the implications are. I too looked at the OMB report that was released on September 14th, and I realized, you know, page after page was line item after line item, whether it be DOD, civilian agencies, on 9.4% cut, 8.6% cut, 7.4% cut. As a longstanding resident of the District of Columbia, somewhere on page 200 and something was reference to the district, cuts to the expenditures and outlays that we've furnished to the District of Columbia. Again, something that I was not at all privy to at the time, but suddenly sort of it caught my eye. So I think the first thing as a member of the financial community is we are grappling with how to navigate these unintended consequences, the unknowns, the uncertainties, which inherently connote greater risk. I'd also mention a couple other things. During the first panel, there was a discussion about the number of legislative challenges that will exist during the lame duck session. There are two others that for us in the financial industry we are focused on very carefully. One is, the estimate today is somewhere between maybe the third week in December and the first 2 weeks of January, we will once again breach the debt ceiling. And I think we all can remember last August. We can all remember what a political lightning rod that became. So not only do we have Bush sunset provisions, not only do we have unemployment tax, not only do we have sequestration, but we also have now on top of that the issue of navigating a further increase to the debt ceiling. Finally, we also had last week, I think, a fairly clear, I guess the best way to put it is, shot across our bow from Moody's. I think Moody's was endeavoring to telegraph well in advance so that there wasn't a sense of surprise this notion that unless the United States federal government is able to adopt something that is akin to Bowles-Simpson in some form or fashion that addresses, I think the way they put it, medium to long-term debt to GDP, they essentially have indicated that they would likely seek to downgrade the sovereign debt of the United States. So for us in our industry, that too is an additional wrinkle around, well, what does that mean to Treasury yields? And implications on Treasury yields have implications in the private sector borrowing rates as well. So we, from our vantage point, see sort of a compendium of issues that we're going to have to navigate in a very short period of time. So with that, for the bankers, we recognize that at the core, the capital we provide is a vital ingredient to operating private sector businesses. It's a vital ingredient for a source of flexible capital, and that is inherent in what we do in our functions. Obviously, we provide a myriad of other services, but at the core, it's that lending relationship that allows our clients to continue to grow.
Jim, we've just seen Peter Knickerbocker, Bank of America, and he had some really great advice in terms of what companies should be doing to team with their bank. Would you like to give a highlight of some of those points, particularly from your perspective, and what all of your members and everybody should be doing at this time?
Well, in difficult times, it's always important to team up with your banks to get through it, to understand what the risks are and more. I think Peter and the other speakers that we had throughout the morning program at the Board of Trade really did hit on the fact that this is not something to be done in isolation. So sit down with your lawyers, sit down with your accountants, but specifically on the banks, well, they want to know about your cash flow analysis. They want to know about where you're going to go with a staffing plan, your overall contingency plans, and don't do that in isolation. Sit down with them early on, have the conversations and work through it. I thought it was very sound advice.
It was all sound advice. And he also mentioned the threat of the Moody's downgrade. That's going to have reverberations that are even more extensive. There's a compendium of issues. What does that downgrade mean, and what would you hope the government would heed with regard to that?
Well, Hillary, you'd think that if Moody's and Standard & Poor's threaten the downgrade of the U.S. economy as they have, if sequestration were to go through, it would get Congress's attention. It doesn't seem to make a difference on Capitol Hill. And the implications for such a downgrade are severe to the states, to the local counties, certainly to credit availability of businesses and more. At a time when uncertainty in the economy is the last thing we need, this is going to add yet another layer to a very uncertain time.
It is. And speaking of uncertainty, one of the things that Deborah Nixon, the partner from Ernst Young, mentioned was that businesses need to forecast. You're talking about planning, of course, putting together sort of a preparedness, almost internal committee like you would for a disaster. What about the things that Deborah Nixon said? We'll go to her clip in a moment, but some of your high-level opinions about her content.
Well, it was very much in line with the advice and counsel that the Board of Trade has been sharing for quite some time on sequestration and, as you say, even other emergencies. Put a hot team together, a task force right away, get the key players in your office, CFO, COO, certainly the head of HR, your legal department, maybe your government affairs department, in this instance, government contracting officers and the rest, and start to understand the interdependencies, start to understand the risks, the liabilities, so you can start to develop a plan going forward. I think Deborah did a tremendous job organizing that.
Yes, she did. We're actually going to, with our audience now, have a look at that clip, if we may. One of the things that Deborah brought to the table was that she was formerly a proposal manager. So she's really on top of tactical and practical issues that she really felt that a contractor goes through.
She did a great job.
She did. Let's look.
There's a one-liner that I love, and that one-liner says, sequestration is the equivalent of doing cosmetic surgery with a chainsaw. And I love that one-liner because it says it all. And if you think about it, what comes to mind? Cosmetic surgery with a chainsaw. Whatever that is, it's really ugly. And that's what we're dealing with sequestration. But I look at it more as not a reality for government contractors. And let me give you, you heard my background. I'm not here to speak to you as an Ernst Young auditor. That's not what I am. I'm a government contracts practitioner, and this is what I've done for over 25 years. And prior to coming to Ernst Young, I worked in industry. And when I worked in industry, I worked as a contracts manager. And I worked as a proposal manager. So when I think about sequestration, I think about the impact on the company. So while everybody is talking about what Congress and what agencies will do, I think about it in terms of when the rubber hits the road, what does it mean to a contractor? What does it mean to my business? What does it mean to my financial planning and analysis? So that's the perspective that I bring here today. And as a proposal manager in business, there was always, we went through this huge exercise to forecast our revenues, forecast our indirect rates or for forward pricing rates, and price our proposals. And in that, we did a lot of gymnastics and exercises to calculate what's the best case and what's the worst case and what's the most probable case scenario. But what we usually ended up going with was the gut. What does your gut instinct tell you? And my gut instinct tells me that regardless of sequestration, whether we're talking about deficit reduction or whether we're talking about budget cuts, we're still talking about something that is very transformative to a government contractor and a government contractor's business model. But when we talk about sequestration, we take the context of budget cuts and deficit reduction, and we put a time clock on it. And that's a very near ticking down count that we're looking at. So it just accelerates the process of what we're looking at. So I look at sequestration really as a continuation of what most government contractors started with their planning about 3 years ago with the Ash-Carter-Gates initiative with increasing efficiency in DOD. And with that, we saw companies start to plan. The interesting thing about those initiatives that DOD listed out their roadmap, and there were 23 or 25 guidelines that were put out in this roadmap, many of which focus squarely on contractors. And they focus largely on contractors' overhead cost and contractors' profitability. And with the FY13 National Defense Authorization, we see a lot of those recommendations associated with those guidelines come into the defense authorization. So we're seeing targets focused on efficiency and profitability aimed at contractors. So when I think about it in the context of what contractors started to do some 3 years ago and where we are today with sequestration, I think about one difference. And that difference tends to be the focus on cutting your base, cutting your direct labor base, cutting your contract base. And if you're a bean counter, and I am a bean counter, when I think about cutting my base, I also have to think about what it does to my rates, my multiplier, my wrap rate that I use to go to market with. And when I cut my base, my rates go up. And when my indirect rates go up, I am far less competitive in the marketplace. And when my rates go up and I go to market with a strategic position of a higher price, one, I don't have a price to win, or it's very hard to win. And two, if I am operating in what the government likes to call this most advantageous bid environment.
Jim, we just saw Deborah, and she had some very practical points. She talked about the fact that she thinks like a company, and that's what obviously all government contractors need to do. What did you think were some of the high points of her advice for a government contractor?
Well, Deborah does a great job, and certainly we've worked with a lot of the accounting firms around here to ask their advice. They really do say, get a task force together, start to go through the interdependencies with subcontractors, perhaps other partners that you have in the government contracting field, and understand the risks, the liabilities, where the opportunities exist, but get a plan together as soon as possible. She did an excellent job in keeping that organized and laying it out for everybody in the audience.
Yes, she did. She was very good. And talking about keeping things organized, you kept the program very organized, you kept the Board of Trade going well. You've been with the Board of Trade since '06, good 6 years now, Jim. You've seen a lot in this region. What do you think that this region is doing to prepare, and what should government contractors in particular do on a global basis in this region to be better prepared?
Well, Hillary, it's been a wonderful time at the Board of Trade. I enjoy the job. There's always a challenge. I'm blessed with a wonderful leadership and a great staff that really make things happen. And if the Board of Trade can continue to provide good advice and counsel, I think that's a valuable role, certainly in these uncertain times. Where people should focus their attention, and specifically government contractors, they do need to start doing something now. They can't wish and hope that this changes. It really does seem very likely, the closer we get to January 2nd, that the sequestration cuts will take place. And even if they don't, there will be significant reductions in the deficit, primarily on the backs of the businesses in Greater Washington.
There's a 100% chance of that.
A 100% chance of that. So the details need to be worked out. Precious little guidance coming from the federal government now, but there are practical ways to do scenario planning. It was the essence of the program from the Greater Washington Board of Trade. We encourage businesses to partner up with their trusted advisors, the Board of Trade being one.
Yes. And we saw the keys of winning, so thank you very much. Our government contractors want to know how to win contracts, preparedness, teaming with all of your partners, and also thank you very much, because the content did help most people, I think, know how to prepare. So thank you, Jim. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
It was wonderful to have Jim Dinegar, CEO of the Board of Trade, with us today. Now I'd like to introduce Jim McCarthy, owner and technical director of Key Solutions, so that he can address for you, the audience, what you should do as a government contractor to be prepared.
Good morning. Thank you, Hillary. This morning when we watched Jim Dinegar and Hillary talk, there was one thing that I really took away from that exchange, and that is this. Nobody is really sure what's going to happen with sequestration. Maybe there's a 50% chance that something's going to happen, maybe it won't, but there is a 100% chance that there are going to be cuts. Now, as I go to into the community and talk to government contractors and clients and government officials, one of the things that I'm picking up basically is that this industry, this government contracting industry, is in a funk. The doom and gloom is spreading over this town very thickly. And what I want to try to tell you today is that, yeah, maybe times are going to be tough, but if we do the right things, we can emerge from this tough time a stronger company, a better company, a faster company, more agile and more responsive to our clients. So I'm here today to really give the advice and some thoughts on what smart contractors are doing in this town in order to prepare for the coming storm. And I want to leave you 5 points. Point number 1 is they are employing a laser, not a shotgun. In other words, they're picking their targets carefully rather than blasting out proposals all over town in hopes that maybe they might win something. They're choosing their targets based on their core competencies. They're getting back to their core strengths, to their historic strengths, and to in their swim lanes, if you will. So the first thing that they're doing is basically using that laser. The second thing they're doing is they're employing the model, teaming model. There was a time in this industry when it was relatively rare that there were teams. There were large primes, integrators, monolithic contractors that went after these large opportunities. Today, the model has sort of shifted, and today there are ample opportunities, and it's actually the rule rather than the exception, that there are subcontractors, prime contractors, joint ventures, and so on. So what the smart companies are doing is they are strategically aligning themselves with companies of similar culture and like mind, and they are strengthening their offering that they give to the government by teaming. The third thing that government contractors are doing who are preparing for the storm is basically they are taking the steps to reduce costs in-house. They are getting themselves into a better position from a competitive standpoint. They are reducing indirect costs. They're getting ready to target the necessary staff reductions that occur. They are making all the right choices to prepare for when the time that they have to flip that switch. So preparedness is the key. And then the fourth thing that government contractors are doing to stay ahead of it is basically they're not giving up. In other words, they are looking at new growth markets, and there are new and emerging markets that are available to government contractors if they're on the prowl. Markets such as the intelligence community, cybersecurity, the VA, healthcare, and IT information technology associated with that. These appear to be markets that are very promising if somebody can get out in front of those markets and apply their trade. The fifth thing that they're doing, basically, I'm going to just say, is they're stepping up their game. And what I mean is contract execution is the absolute best marketing that a company can ever do. The best client is the current client. And so smart companies are turning all of their program staff and all their support staff into essentially business developers by performing in a superb manner in each and every day in everything that they do. So there you have it, five things that smart companies are going to do so that if the storm occurs, they are prepared for it and can react. Someone is going to emerge from this time of, I guess, austerity, a stronger company, a better company. Why not let it be you? Thank you very much. Now back to you, Hillen.
Thank you for joining us today. We covered a really important topic. And if you remember just one issue from our program today, you must have a plan in place. If you don't already have a plan, tomorrow morning is Monday. Pull your team together. Start your planning process with your team. And we hope you'll make it part of your plan to join us next week.
You've been watching Government Contracting Weekly, sponsored each week by AOC Key Solutions Incorporated. Government Contracting Weekly is the only television program devoted exclusively to the competitive and dynamic world of government contracting. For additional information, comments, questions, or suggestions, please write us at governmentcontractingweekly.com.